Throughout modern investigative history, authorities have documented cases in which individuals vanished without leaving physical evidence, confirmed sightings, or reliable traces, forcing investigators to confront situations where disappearance occurs. Despite established surveillance systems and standardized investigative procedures designed to prevent such outcomes, these disappearances are categorized separately from typical missing person cases because they lack indicators of violence, preparation, or intent, removing the foundational clues normally used to determine whether a disappearance was voluntary, accidental, or criminal in nature. In many verified cases, the individuals were last observed performing routine activities such as commuting, shopping, or attending appointments, behavior that suggests continuity rather than disruption, making the sudden absence particularly difficult to contextualize. Investigators rely heavily on behavioral analysis during early stages. Yet in these cases, background checks, interviews, and personal histories often reveal no psychological distress, conflict, or instability that might explain an intentional disappearance. Surveillance technology is assumed to provide coverage in public and semi-public environments, but numerous disappearances occur in areas monitored by cameras, access controls, and digital tracking systems that nevertheless fail to produce a complete visual or chronological record. Reviews of surveillance footage frequently reveal partial documentation, showing individuals entering locations without corresponding exit footage, highlighting blind spots, system limitations, or human oversight within monitoring infrastructure. These gaps complicate reconstruction efforts, as investigators must infer movement rather than confirm it, increasing reliance on probability instead of verifiable sequence. Digital evidence has become central to modern investigations, yet some disappearance cases involve abrupt termination of phone signals, location data, and financial activity without technical explanation or subsequent reactivation. Analysts must then determine whether such digital silence results from deliberate actions, technical failure, environmental interference, or unknown external events, each possibility carrying different investigative implications. The absence of digital interaction after disappearance eliminates common investigative anchors, such as transaction trails or communication records, significantly reducing the ability to establish post-disappearance movement. Vehicles linked to missing individuals are sometimes later discovered intact and undamaged, containing personal belongings that contradict theories of voluntary departure or planned disappearance. The presence of essential items within abandoned vehicles introduces contradictions that investigators must reconcile, as intentional disappearance typically involves removal of identifying materials and resources. Family accounts often emphasize the individual's future plans, responsibilities, and stability, contributing context that challenges assumptions of self-initiated absence. While investigators remain cautious about relying solely on retrospective testimony, consistent patterns across unrelated cases reinforce the difficulty of explaining these disappearances through conventional psychological models. Collectively, these cases establish a phenomenon defined not by dramatic events, but by absence of evidence, placing investigators in a position where lack of information becomes the central obstacle rather than a starting point. As investigations progress, authorities begin comparing these disappearances across jurisdictions, identifying recurring structural similarities such as sudden loss of contact, absence of physical struggle, and incomplete surveillance coverage, which suggests systemic limitations rather than isolated investigative failure. One recurring challenge involves the assumption that populated environments naturally produce witnesses. Yet many disappearances occur in locations where bystanders later report seeing nothing unusual or fail to recall specific details. Human perception and memory limitations complicate these cases, as routine environments rarely prompt heightened attention, allowing critical moments to pass unnoticed and undocumented. Investigators must therefore evaluate not only what witnesses report, but also what they may have failed to perceive, introducing uncertainty into timeline reconstruction. In several documented cases, Access-controlled spaces, such as office buildings, parking structures, or transit hubs, become focal points due to incomplete or malfunctioning entry and exit records. Audits of these systems often reveal maintenance gaps, synchronization errors, or data retention limitations that undermine assumptions of comprehensive monitoring. These technical shortcomings demonstrate how reliance on automated systems can create false confidence in coverage and traceability. Search operations typically commence quickly, yet early delays or misinterpretation of last known locations can significantly reduce the likelihood of recovering meaningful evidence. Environmental variables such as weather, terrain, and urban infrastructure can further degrade evidence within short time frames, narrowing investigative windows. As time passes, cases shift from active search to analytical review, where investigators reassess initial assumptions and identify potential oversights. However, absence of new information limits the effectiveness of retrospective analysis, often resulting in circular reasoning rather than resolution. Interagency coordination introduces additional complexity, as jurisdictional boundaries and differing protocols can fragment investigative responsibility. Communication gaps between agencies may delay data sharing, hindering comprehensive analysis during critical early stages. These structural challenges contribute to cases remaining unresolved, not due to lack of effort, but due to compounded systemic constraints. By this stage, investigators often recognize that conventional investigative models may be insufficient to explain disappearances characterized primarily by absence rather than evidence. As cases remain unresolved, investigators increasingly rely on pattern analysis, comparing timelines, behaviors, and environmental contexts across multiple disappearances to identify structural similarities that might suggest overlooked mechanisms rather than isolated anomalies. This comparative approach often reveals that many individuals vanished within narrow time windows, sometimes minutes apart from last confirmed contact, emphasizing how quickly disappearance can occur without generating observable disturbance. The brevity of these windows limits investigative intervention, as authorities are often notified only after significant time has passed, reducing opportunities for immediate containment or observation. Technological assumptions play a critical role, as investigators expect mobile devices, cameras, and transaction systems to generate traceable data. Yet real cases demonstrate how these systems can fail simultaneously or independently. Failures may result from environmental interference, infrastructure limitations, or human behavior, none of which necessarily leave clear indicators within available records. The absence of corroborating data forces investigators to consider multiple competing explanations without sufficient evidence to prioritize one conclusively. Over time, cases accumulate unresolved elements, transforming them into cold cases defined more by unanswered questions than by actionable leads. Periodic review of these cases is conducted as new technologies emerge, including advances in data analytics, facial recognition, and forensic reconstruction. While such advances have resolved some historical cases, many disappearances remain resistant, suggesting that missing data cannot always be recovered retroactively. Families often continue to provide information long after official investigations slow, contributing personal records, memories, and hypotheses in hope of renewed attention. The prolonged uncertainty places emotional strain on relatives, who must navigate legal, psychological, and social consequences without closure. Investigators acknowledge that absence of evidence does not equate to absence of event. Yet without confirmation, definitive conclusions remain unattainable. These cases challenge the assumption that modern society can always account for individual movement and presence. They expose the limitations of surveillance, investigation, and documentation when critical moments go unobserved. At this point in the investigation, the phenomenon of people vanishing without a trace stands not as an anomaly, but as a documented reality that continues to resist explanation. As investigations move beyond initial search phases, authorities often revisit early assumptions, recognizing that first interpretations of timelines and locations may have unintentionally narrowed the scope of inquiry and excluded alternative movement paths. Reanalysis frequently reveals that last confirmed sightings were treated as fixed endpoints rather than probabilistic markers, limiting exploration of unverified routes or short deviations that could fundamentally alter understanding of the disappearance. This reliance on last known positions highlights a structural limitation, as investigative models depend heavily on confirmation rather than uncertainty, which may obscure critical transitional moments. In some cases, later discoveries show that key information was overlooked not due to negligence, but because it appeared insignificant when viewed without contextual hindsight. Witness statements revisited years later often gain relevance when compared against broader patterns identified in unrelated cases, demonstrating how isolated details may only gain meaning through comparison. Despite this, memory degradation and inconsistent recall introduce reliability issues, making retrospective witness analysis inherently limited. Investigators also confront institutional constraints, including case prioritization, funding limitations, and staffing changes that disrupt continuity over long periods. These disruptions can lead to fragmented knowledge, where no single investigator retains comprehensive understanding of the case history. Technological evolution introduces both opportunity and challenge, as older data formats, storage limitations, and privacy regulations may restrict access to historical records. Even when data exists, legal and technical barriers can prevent effective re-examination using modern tools. Some disappearances involve cross-jurisdictional complexity, where movement across municipal or national boundaries introduces additional layers of procedural delay. Coordination across jurisdictions depends on timely information sharing, which may not occur uniformly in the early stages of investigation. This fragmentation can prevent formation of a coherent narrative, leaving investigators with disconnected fragments rather than a continuous sequence. Over time, unresolved disappearances accumulate administrative classifications that shift focus from active search to archival status. Once categorized as cold cases, investigative momentum often diminishes despite ongoing interest from families and advocacy groups. Families frequently assume the role of independent investigators, gathering records, organizing information, and maintaining public awareness. While these efforts can generate renewed attention, they may also reflect the gap between institutional capacity and unresolved demand for answers. Psychological analysis of disappearance cases reveals that prolonged uncertainty produces distinct forms of grief, often described as ambiguous loss. This condition complicates emotional resolution, as absence prevents confirmation of death, while hope prevents closure. From an investigative perspective, ambiguous loss also complicates decision-making, as neither survival nor death can be conclusively established. Some cases experience renewed interest following unrelated discoveries, technological breakthroughs, or changes in investigative standards. Yet even with renewed scrutiny, missing foundational evidence limits the effectiveness of re-examination. These limitations underscore the importance of early-stage data preservation and comprehensive documentation. Despite lessons learned, new disappearance cases continue to emerge with similar structural characteristics. This repetition suggests that systemic vulnerabilities remain unresolved within investigative and monitoring frameworks. The phenomenon challenges confidence in assumptions about traceability, accountability, and oversight in modern environments. It reveals how routine settings can still allow disappearance without detection. Investigators acknowledge that not all unknowns can be resolved through technology alone. Human behavior, environmental complexity, and system limitations interact in ways that resist linear explanation. These cases persist because they lack definitive endpoints rather than because they lack investigative effort. Over time, unresolved disappearances transition from individual cases to collective patterns. These patterns raise broader questions about how disappearance is defined, detected, and interpret it. They also challenge legal, social, and institutional frameworks designed to provide resolution. The absence of answers becomes an enduring feature rather than a temporary phase. For investigators, the challenge lies not only in finding evidence, but in acknowledging when evidence may never surface. For families, uncertainty becomes a permanent condition rather than a stage to overcome. Society often moves on, but unresolved cases remain embedded in records and memory. Each disappearance adds to a growing archive of unanswered questions. These archives reflect the limits of certainty in complex systems. The phenomenon endures because it cannot be conclusively disproven or resolved. It remains a documented reality rather than a theoretical possibility. People continue to vanish without explanation. Investigations continue without closure. The question remains open, suspended between evidence and absence. The facts are real. The explanation is up to you.